Hi, I'm Melissa Bourbon, and I write the Legends novels with Scream, Silent Echoes, and Silent Obsession. I'm going to read to you an excerpt from Silent Obsession, which features Ray Vargas and Johanna Rios. Prologue. San Julio River, Texas, 21 years prior. Johanna Rios dug her feet into the dirt of the San Julio riverbank, gasping in the deep, chilled Texas air. Overhead, dark clouds loomed, closing in and pressing down on her. A spring storm bearing down fast. "No, Mama, don't!" She yelled at the top of her lungs, pulling against her mother's hold on her wrist, but her mother jerked her forward until she was ankle-deep in water. Jo was strong for 11, but not strong enough to stop a woman who had madness in her mind, her mother. "I told you this day would come. It'll be over soon, Joey." Mama spat out the nickname she'd given her. "Johanna, terrible name. He named you that and then left me alone. They all leave." Carmen, Johanna's 9-year-old sister, stood on the north side of the bank, just visible in Johanna's peripheral vision. She let out a high-pitched scream and ran to Jo's side, tears spilling down her wind-chapped cheeks, but Mama yanked Johanna deeper into the river. "She promised me, once you're gone, she'll let a man." Mom cruelly twisted Jo's hand and yanked her daughter down until Jo was on her knees. "Come to me, and this time he'll stay." Mama was talking about the curse of La Llorona, but the ghost wasn't real to anyone but her mother. Pain sliced up Jo's arm and she grimaced, fighting back a scream. She dug her heels into the sludge, mentally willing Carmen to run, to save herself. But scared little Carmen came closer, unsure of what to do, and Mama grabbed her too, then jerked Carmen into the river, shouting, "Stop crying!" The roar of the rushing water in the San Julio River filled Jo's ears. She sucked in a shaky breath and fought back, kicking her feet against the ground, splashing the shallow water until the hem of Mama's torn, gauzy, white embroidered dress was drenched. She clawed, finally managing to pry Mama's fingers from her wrist, then broke free, stumbling back. But Mama plowed into the river, her black hair flying out behind her, her dress floating up around her like an umbrella, dragging Carmen in her wake. "No!" Jo plunged into the river. The cold hit her with a fierce burning, worse than jumping into a barrel of smoking coals. She fought to the surface and gasped for breath, then saw Carmen being dragged down into the depths of the river by the weight of her own white peasant dress. Mama spun around, pulling Carmen with her, the water rippling out around her. She jerked suddenly and twisted Carmen until she was face down in the water. The back of Carmen's head bopped up and down like an apple in a barrel. In a low voice and filled with wrath, Mama said to Jo, "She cursed you too. She's in your blood, in both of you." Mama looked behind Jo as if she saw the 500-year-old crying woman of legend, but there was only the water and the central Texas woods filled with scraggly trees. "La Llorona," she whispered hoarsely. Jo used Mama's distraction and grabbed Carmen away from her mother, but the current was too strong. The San Julio grabbed her sister, sweeping her downstream. Jo plunged after Carmen, snatching her leg, pulling with all her might until she could grab hold of her wrist. She dragged her limp sister toward the bank, swallowing a bellyful of water as she struggled. Her feet found the ground and she crawled onto the bank, dragging Carmen with her. A moment later, her sister coughed, and water trickled out the side of her mouth. She sucked in a loud, desperate breath and struggled to sit up. "It's okay," Jo said, cradling Carmen. "It's going to be okay." But when Jo looked back to the river, Mama was floating. Face up, her hair cascading around her head in a silky mass. Air caught in Jo's throat and her eyes burned. Nothing was ever going to be okay again. La Llorona. Jo heard the name as if it was carried on the white tips of the current. She jerked her head around to look where her mother still stared, her heart drumming in her ears, praying that she wouldn't see the weeping woman who drowned her children. There was nothing there. She turned back to see her mother being pulled swiftly downstream. Her eyes locked with her Mama's for a second, and Jo felt a whisper of sheer terror, like Mama was passing on the curse. Mama's gaze broke with hers, and her eyes became lifeless, dead. Her body rolled over in the water until she floated face down. The water carried her downstream until all Jo could see was the flash of white from her dress mixing with the scattered whitecaps. Dripping wet and shivering, Jo stared at the river. Carmen sobbed, and Jo struggled to fight back her own tears. She had her sister. They had each other. She was not cursed. La Llorona was dead, a ghost. Jo would not let the crying woman ruin her life. She would not be like her mother. Chapter 1. San Julio River, Texas, present day. Ray Vargas stood at the front of the small crowd, his face numb as he watched his longtime friend, Deputy Sheriff Derek Brado, bury his boots in the sludge of the San Julio River. Together they stared at the dead woman floating. Correction, a dead girl, not a dead woman. Brado had called early, woken him up just as the sun rose, saying they had an unidentified drowning victim on the banks of the river, a female, possibly a teenager, with a San Julio high-class ring on her finger. No one had called in a missing persons report, so the ring was all they had to go by, but Brado had thought Ray might be able to identify the victim. As the principal of the only high school within 50 miles, this wasn't the first time Ray had been asked to ID a kid. That was the main reason Brado had made him a reserve deputy. Usually, Brado called him to identify some kid trying to pull one over on the deputies using an older brother's driver's license to buy booze, but not this time. This time, a girl had been murdered. What a way to start the day. Ray peered down the embankment at the girl. Dark hair covered her face, fanned out around her head. River water muddied her white peasant dress. Her body was lodged in a mound of rocks, keeping her from floating away. Only her bare feet drifted back and forth in the swiftly moving current. The current shifted, sweeping her hair off her face. Breath rushed out of him and his mouth went bone dust dry. Oh, shit. Oh, God, no. He knew her. Marianne Sandoval, his daughter's friend. Bile churned in his belly. How could this have happened? He'd just seen Marianne 3 nights ago. What she'd done that night and how he'd reacted seemed almost surreal now. He struggled to breathe steadily. Recognize the girl? Brado asked. A sprinkling of water spattered Ray's face. He looked up at the scudding clouds, better than looking at the dead girl. I know her. Guilt pooled in Ray's gut. He struggled to get a hold of it. 3 nights ago, his daughter's 18-year-old friend had tried to tempt him, tried to proposition him. He'd sent her away, but damn it, he should have driven her home, should have called her parents and told them their underage daughter was drunk in the bar he and his brother owned. For years, he'd worried about his daughter's friendship with someone as wild as Marianne, had hoped Eva would dump her friend. He wished Marianne would take off, leave San Julio. His eyes burned. He hated himself for his thoughts. He turned back to Brado, cleared his throat, and said, Her name is Marianne Sandoval, graduated from San Julio High in the spring with Eva. She was in El Charro a few nights ago, drunk as all get out. He didn't tell Brado she'd come on to him. No sense in humiliating the dead girl. She left with some guy in a ball cap. That's all I know. When was that? Tuesday night. Behind him, he heard murmurs. Brado's staff had secured the area, but a few people stood behind the yellow crime scene tape. He recognized Brado's partner, Deputy Adams, a woman in her early 40s who settled in San Julio 5 years ago but was still considered a newcomer. Next to her stood Dave McAllen, whose property they stood on, a San Julio alum Ray recalled from the school files. He wondered if that's who found the girl. He didn't recognize the other people, but they were official county jackets, investigators, the medical examiner, coroner maybe. He checked his watch. He had an hour and 20 minutes before school started. He knew the drill. Once Brado informed Marianne's parents she'd been murdered, word would leak out and a frenzy of grief for Marianne Sandoval would start. Small towns made for hotbeds of gossip and shared pain. San Julio High students would remember her and care, would grieve. So would her teachers, Johanna Rios in particular. Marianne wouldn't have graduated without Johanna's support. Ray had grown up with Johanna, known her as a quiet girl who'd become a strong and caring teacher, a woman whose beauty matched her brains, although he'd never overstep his professional boundaries and tell her this. Shit. He kicked a mud clump on the ground. As soon as Brado allowed him, he'd have to inform his staff of Marianne's murder, and he didn't think he could bear to see the pain on Johanna's face. But that would be nothing compared with the pain he knew he'd seen in Eva's when he told her one of her best friends had been murdered. Hell, he couldn't even bear the pain sitting heavily on his own chest. At the river, the medical examiner and her team worked. The ME bent over Marianne's body while a tech snapped pictures of the scene and another walked gingerly around the area, marking things with small cards. Another tech brought over a black body bag, its silver zipper forming a dull vertical line. Ray's gut twisted. Christ. He thought he was done with body bags when he left Afghanistan. Apparently not. Forcing his breathing to remain steady, he turned to examine the body floating in the river. The dress and the fact that Marianne wasn't wearing any shoes didn't add up. She had lived in low-cut tops and painted-on jeans. A peasant dress wasn't something she'd be caught dead in. Oh, God. Guilt, chagrin, and regret swept over him. Marianne had been a kid, fresh out of high school. She hadn't deserved to die, to be murdered. Even in the wide open space, suffocation took him over. He fought it back, breathing from his diaphragm the way he'd been taught in the military. Now that Brado had the ID, did he need to stay? Ray turned to seek out Brado. He wanted to leave, needed to formulate his thoughts on what to say to his student body and staff, but his friend was speaking intently to Dave McGowan. The deputy notched his head toward the river. Know anything about the girl in the water? Dave shoved his cowboy hat up on his head and peered down at the body, his dark blonde hair damp from the light rain, his buttoned-up suit and tie out of place by the river. No, he finally said. Hear anything going on out here early this morning or last night? Brado's gaze shifted to the access road between Dave's house and the next house several acres over. Ray knew the layout perfectly without having to look. He and Brado had sowed their wild oats out here on the riverbanks. Not much had changed. A few sturdy farmhouses remained, while others had fallen into decay and near collapse. The earth around them was barren, save for the cluster of trees close to the river and the brush clumped here and there. Around the bend and farther down, a row of old fishing cabins had once dotted the river path. He stayed at one of the old cabins with Eva once on a fishing expedition. Strong girl. She hadn't even squealed when he'd taught her to gut a fish. A few years ago, he'd gone to rent one of the cabins again, but they'd all been torn down. Eva hadn't seemed too upset by the news. By then, she'd been interested in boys and fashion, not in hanging out with her dad gutting fish. She'd been ready to leave the innocence of childhood behind. God, he wished he could protect her forever. Movement caught Ray's attention. Dave had taken a step toward the embankment as if to get a closer look, but Brado quickly blocked his path. You sure you don't know anything about this girl? Brado asked. Dave shook his head, started to say something, then stopped. He stared, furrowing his brow. She looks a little bit like a girl my brother went out with once, I guess. Brado wrote in his notebook, What's your brother's name? Dave cocked an eyebrow. Why? Brado's posture straightened. Because I asked. Dave was a guy with a temper, from what Ray could recall from the school files. He'd graduated before Ray became principal, but Dave's younger brother, Will, had sat across Ray's desk a few times. Temperamental, too, but without the attitude. Dave ran his hand over his chin before folding his arms over his chest. My brother is William McAllen. He works in the auto body shop, but I said she just looks like a girl he dated. So both brothers had elected to stay in San Julio. Most kids took off after high school and never came back. Others, like Ray, joined the military. A few stayed, choosing to live the small-town blue-collar life. That night at the bar, Marianne had bragged about how she was going to find a way to make it big in San Julio. How she never wanted to leave. Lifers, they called people like her, and himself, his brother Vic, Derek Brado, Johanna Rios, and Johanna's sister Carmen. With Marianne's wild personality, he would have pegged her as one who'd wanted to leave and never look back. He'd guessed wrong. Marianne and her murder would become lore. Deputy! The medical examiner's shout halted Brado and Dave's conversation. She waved Brado over. Find something? Brado called out. She gave one succinct nod. Crouching down, she lifted Marianne Sandoval's arm with gloved fingers. A note, pinned to her dress, she said, sealed in a plastic baggie. Ray started. Could Brado have been wrong? Could it have been suicide instead of murder? They made their way down to the body as the guy with the camera snapped a series of photographs from behind the ME. When he was done, the doctor carefully undid the safety pin and slipped it into the evidence pouch. Then she opened up the zippered baggie and slipped out a square of paper. It's in Spanish, she said, after looking at it. Brado pulled a pair of latex gloves from his pocket and worked his hands into them. He took the note from her and scanned it silently, then read it aloud. First, La Ramera submerged the child in the river until there was only silence. A tornado of prickly chills went up Ray's spine. This was no suicide. Shivering in her pajamas, Johanna Rios stood in her kitchen, glaring at her sister. She set down her mug of coffee with a thunk, tension twisting inside her. We had plans for tonight. Carmen leaned against their kitchen counter, her hands gripping the lip of the formica. She shrugged apologetically. Come on, Joe. Will got the night off. Unbelievable. Joe leaned across the counter and snatched her reading glasses off the stack of student essays she'd read the night before, then grabbed her book bag. So you're standing me up again. This guy must really be something. He is. Carmen wagged her finger. You could try it, go out on a date, kiss someone, fool around. Might do you good. An image of Ray Vargas flashed in her mind, and Joe felt her blood thicken in her veins. She had better things to do than let herself get wrapped up in the Cinderella fantasy. Easier to keep people on the periphery, which she did most of the time, except her best friend Keisha, and Carmen usually. But lately, Carmen tended to disappoint her. She should be used to it, but each time Carmen pushed her away, another hole grew in her heart. She blew out a breath, grabbed a stack of essays, and shoved them into the book bag, then stalked to her room to get ready for work. She pulled her clothes out of the closet before realizing Carmen had trailed in after her. So much for ignoring her sister. Carmen leaned into the dresser and examined herself in the mirror. She fluffed her hair, then turned around. You have to stop dwelling on the past, Meet a man, get laid, marry him, and have his children. Right. No matter how appealing fairy tales were, Joe couldn't have believed in happily ever after. Not for her. The Rios women don't do marriage, remember? You're kidding yourself. The corner of Carmen's mouth tugged up in a slight smile. I think I'll chance it. Will, maybe. Her smile grew and her voice took on its serious tone. The one. Joe hadn't even met this guy, Will, and he was her sister's soulmate? Someone her sister was thinking of marrying? Carmen was setting herself up for pain and heartbreak, and there was nothing Joe could do about it. She tried to smile, to be happy, but Carmen's move towards independence meant Joe could no longer be the one to clean up her sister's messes or protect her. If she could bring herself to believe in happily ever after, that might be good. But the concept eluded her. Still, she made herself nod encouragingly. Really? Her sister threw her bony arms wide, wrapped them around herself in a hug. Yes, everything will be just fine. No worries. And yet, hadn't Carmen just gotten over a fling with the pharmacist at the drugstore where she worked? Like all the men before, the pharmacist had dumped her cold. Now suddenly Will was her future? That's great, Joe said, but she felt uneasy. Could he provide for Carmen, protect her? Would he stay with her? Just be careful. She placed a sweater and dress slacks on her bed. You barely just met him. You know as well as I do that people are capable of all kinds of things. Take it slow. Carmen scoffed. Joe stifled the urge to shove Carmen into the closet and lock her in to keep her safe. She'd spent her entire life trying to protect her, but she knew she had to let her go. It was time. Carmen was a grown woman now, 30 years old. They had to make their own mistakes. If only she didn't lose herself whenever a man entered the picture. Joe blew out a breath. At least her sister seemed happy. When can I meet him? Carmen's face relaxed and her eyes brightened. Soon. That's great. Carmen moved to the closet and perused the clothes. She took out a jacket and slipped it on. Can I borrow this? Joe glanced up. It hangs on you. Carmen pulled it closed in front of her, the two panels hanging loosely on her. It's fine. Joe peered up at her in full protection mode. You're skin and bones. You have to eat, Carmy. Color stained Carmen's cheeks. I'm fine. Will likes me the way I am. Yes, but... Carmen peeked in the mirror and adjusted the jacket. My turn to mother you, Hermana. You're a hermit, staying in this lonely house all by yourself. When I go out, you barely even live. You need to find yourself a man. As if finding a man would make everything all right. Joe bit back her sadness and frustration. In her sister's mind, all Joe's sacrifices, everything she'd done to keep Carmen from befalling the same tragic fate as their mother, had turned her into a hermit. Seriously, Carmen said, heading for the door, you found your calling, teaching high school kids? I could never do it. If you're not going to have your own kids, it's good you can love someone else's. You picked the right profession. I give them back at the end of the day. She hesitated. No attachments, no obligations. The words rang hollow in her ears. The truth was, she wanted the attachments, the obligations. She wanted to have a family and children of her own. Carmen didn't seem to sense her hesitation. But they love you. I run into your old students all the time at the drugstore. Carmen primped in the mirror, patting her hair. They say we almost look like twins. Joe patted her curvy hip. If it weren't for the 20-pound weight difference. Carmen ignored her. And I always say the same thing. Our looks are the only good thing our dearly departed mother gave us. Joe restrained herself from unleashing a torrent against their mother. They didn't owe a damn thing to the woman. Nothing. Not their brains, not their appearance, nothing. A minute later, Carmen was gone. Joe knew her sister would hook up with Will later, and Joe would whittle away her Friday night with a glass of Shiraz and a hot bath, alone. She checked the clock, 6:46 a.m. She had to hurry. Grabbing underwear and a bra from her dresser, she tossed them on top of her clothes and hurried to the bathroom. 10 minutes later, she emerged from the shower and wrapped herself in a towel. She headed to the bed to get dressed and stopped short. Her bra and panties were gone. She stared at the bed. A sliver of anxiety worked through her. No way would Carmen have borrowed her underclothes. First off, her sister's butt was a good 2 sizes smaller than Joe's, and her C-cup breasts would never fit into Joe's B-cup bra. They shared a lot of things, but not their lingerie. A clacking sound caught her attention. The gentle morning breeze caught the edge of the wooden blind, batting it lightly against the window frame. She had not left the window open. A cold chill crept up her spine as the realization hit. Someone had been in her house, in her bedroom. The cocoon she'd wrapped herself in all these years wasn't as protected as she thought. Keep reading on Scream, Silent Obsession, and Silent Echoes. This is Vic's story. Happy reading.